February 1, 2004, was a huge day in the United States. Nearly 90 million people watched the Super Bowl, where the New England Patriots won a thrilling game against the Carolina Panthers with a score of 32-29. The halftime show, featuring Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson, became one of the most talked about moments of the 2000s. While many celebrated, things were very different in Sarasota, Florida. A massive search was underway for an 11-year-old girl who had disappeared without a trace. The truth about what happened would shock everyone and leave a family, a community, and the whole country heartbroken. Carlie Jane Brewer was born on March 16, 1992, in Long Island to parents Joe and Susan. They divorced when she was just a year old, and Carlie moved to Sarasota with her mom. She visited her family in Long Island during winter and summer breaks, especially loving Christmas time there. Susan remarried and had a son with her new husband, Stephen. Carlie was full of energy and always smiling. Her teacher said she was lovely and delightful, and her principal called her a shining light. She adored her cat Charlie, loved Jennifer Lopez, enjoyed going to the mall, and hanging out with friends. At McIntosh Middle School, where she was in 6th grade, she greeted everyone with big hugs and a warm smile. She sang in the chorus and loved playing sports. Carlie was a girl who truly enjoyed life. On February 1, 2004, Carlie had spent the previous day with her friend, and the pair had had a sleepover. Around 6:15 p.m., she set off back to her house just 1 mile away, as she was due to watch the Super Bowl with her family. Her friend's mother decided to call Susan to check if it was okay for Carlie to be walking home alone. Susan said she didn't want her daughter walking by the busy road as it could be dangerous, and she hadn't given Carlie permission to walk alone. She spoke to her husband Stephen, and he drove off to pick her up. The streets were somewhat quieter as most families were gathered around the television for the Super Bowl. But as Stephen drove around the streets, panic began to set in. He couldn't see Carlie anywhere. She had gone without a trace. Just 1 hour later, 911 was called, and Carlie Brewer was reported as missing. The police were dispatched and soon arrived at Carlie's house. They spoke to all of Carlie's friends to see if they had seen or heard from her, and knocked on neighbors' doors in the hopes that someone had information for them. They spoke to the friend whose house she had stayed at, and her friend's mother. Carlie was described as being a bit upset as her mother and stepdad had been arguing. She had wanted to leave early and go home to spend time with Susan. As news began to spread, the searches got bigger, and the police carried on with them until 3 o'clock in the morning. But there was still no sign of Carlie. It had soon been 12 hours since she had last been seen. As her classmates arrived at school, they were all hoping to see her there, but she didn't turn up. After she failed to make it to school, the police decided to bring in bloodhounds to see if they could trace her scent using one of her pillowcases. Ruby, the bloodhound, tracked her scent to behind E's car wash at 4715 Ridge Road, where it then suddenly stopped. The police quickly sealed off the area and spoke with the owner of the car wash, Mike Evanoff, who told them there were surveillance cameras operated by a motion sensor. Footage from one camera showed the busy main road but an empty parking lot. Another camera from a different angle also showed them nothing. They then checked the camera at the back of the car wash. It was a camera that was triggered by movement, and as they pressed play, it showed a recording taken from 6:21 p.m. on the evening of Carlie's disappearance. It showed a young girl in a red shirt and blue jeans with a pink backpack, exactly what Carlie was wearing on the day she was last seen. Then, suddenly, another person came into view. A man. The man in the video was approximately 5'8" inches with dark hair and tattoos on his arm. He was wearing a mechanic's top with a name tag that was too blurry to be made out. He stopped in front of her, and the pair spoke for a few seconds. He then grabbed her arm and led her away. Even though the footage was just a few seconds long, it painted a terrifying picture. It was clear to all of the officers that Carlie was in grave danger. Her stepfather Stephen was asked to go down to the station to talk to the police. He said he knew something was wrong because Carlie just did not behave this way. She was always sure to call and keep her parents in the loop as to where she was and what she was doing. Based on Stephen's phone records, He was immediately ruled out, but he did say something interesting. He mentioned that as he was driving down Ridge Road looking for Carlie, he had spotted a red truck that was also driving up and down. The truck had pulled into the car wash. Stephen also noted that when he went to her friend's house, the same house Carlie had set off from, a red truck was parked outside. He was sure it was the same one he had seen earlier. The man in the footage was wearing a mechanic's uniform, something often worn by tow truck drivers. The owner of the truck, a man called Ron, lived at Carlie's friend's house and had been there the night before. The police immediately brought him in for questioning. Ron confirmed that Carlie had spent the night at his house and that nothing unusual had happened. He stated that he had woken up Sunday morning and gone about his day as usual. However, the footage in Stephen's account painted a different picture. The investigation continued with urgency, as every moment was critical in finding Carlie Brewer. Ron was ready for work, so he didn't see her at any point after or during the day. He affirmed that he wore a Super Bowl shirt on Sunday. When shown a photograph of Carlie with a man at the car wash, Ron admitted it looked somewhat like him, but insisted it wasn't him. He was cooperative and willing to verify his whereabouts. His boss and time cards confirmed he had been working, and a search of his truck found nothing suspicious. Consequently, Ron was ruled out as a suspect, leaving the police still unsure of the identity of the man in the footage or Carlie's whereabouts. Susan, Carlie's mother, also did not recognize the man in the footage, which worried the community because the abduction occurred in broad daylight with people nearby. A reward of $25,000 was offered for information leading to the capture of Carlie's kidnapper. The police reviewed the footage again and noticed a pale yellow 1992 Buick Century station wagon arriving 3 minutes before Carlie was kidnapped. The car then drove down Ridge Road and stopped outside the car wash. This provided a new lead. The community mobilized, putting up missing person posters and searching extensively. Carlie's mother, Susan, made a public plea for help, and Carlie's father also appealed for information, emphasizing the family's distress and determination to find her. On February 3, 2004, a woman watching the news recognized the man in the footage as a former business associate. She and her husband contacted the police, providing the man's name and address. Detective Vincent Reaver and other officers went to the address, where they met the man's sister, who agreed to bring him out. The man, Joseph Peter Smith, 37, had a lengthy criminal record and was unemployed. Despite his criminal history, including arrests for drug possession and a prior kidnapping charge, he denied involvement in Carlie's abduction. Joseph allowed the police to search his vehicle and room, but nothing incriminating was found. He was arrested for parole violations and drug paraphernalia possession. The investigation took a significant turn when Naomi, the owner of the yellow Buick station wagon, arrived and gave conflicting information about Joseph's whereabouts on the day Carlie disappeared. Her husband, Jeff, later corrected the timeline and provided the car for police examination, revealing that Joseph had used it during the critical time frame. Jeff's information and the subsequent search of the Buick connected Joseph to Carlie's disappearance. Under increased scrutiny, Joseph maintained his innocence but requested an attorney. His brother John, after seeing the news footage, also identified Joseph and recounted suspicious behavior and conversations. John provided crucial information to the FBI, although he initially withheld details. Eventually, John revealed the location of Carlie's body, leading to the tragic discovery in a field behind the Central Church of Christ. Carlie had been brutally murdered, and Joseph's involvement was confirmed through further evidence and John's reluctant confession. And Joseph carried on talking. He said that he had taken what he thought was cocaine on the day of her abduction, and everything that followed was a blur. John said it felt like he was afraid to say, "You know she's dead." So I just said, "Okay, Joe, she's dead. Fine. Where is she? Where is she? We've got to find her. Where is she?" After they left the station, John and his mother had gone to the church to look, but had not found anything. Joseph then told them she was in a field behind the church. John told the agents he hadn't said this before because he didn't believe what Joseph had said and he hadn't actually confessed to killing Carlie. John said he had gone as he was curious to see if anything he said was accurate. He said if he were to find Carlie alive, his plan was to free her, give her money, take a photograph to sell to the media, and then use that money to hire a good lawyer for Joseph. Joseph would eventually confess to sexually assaulting her in the vehicle. He then admitted he had violently raped her. A storm was rolling in, so the decision was made to leave her body in situ overnight and move her in the morning to stop her body from being photographed from above. The police department contacted the White House, which granted a special no-fly zone for the area. Her body was later examined by the Sarasota medical examiner, who determined that she had been dragged into the field and strangled from behind. Ligature marks on her wrists indicated she had been bound. Joseph's DNA was found on her shirt, and it was later reported that the chance of having a DNA profile of a Caucasian man being selected at random that matched the sample was 1 in 32 quintillion. The evidence did not stop there. 2 of her hairs were found in the Buick, and there were 7 fibers found in the Buick that matched Carlie's red shirt. Joseph had dumped her clothes and pink backpack in different bins in a bid to cover his tracks. It was Sheriff Bill Borwell who was given the task every officer dreads. He had to tell Susan. He headed over to her house and broke the news. Susan screamed, "He killed my daughter! He murdered my daughter! He murdered my baby!" Sheriff Bill Borwell then had to tell the public. With his voice breaking as he spoke, he said, "The body of a beautiful 11-year-old girl, Carlie Brucia, has been found. Joseph Smith is under arrest for the abduction and murder of Carlie." Friends, family, and the local community who had searched to try and find her gathered at the church to lay flowers and pay their respects. McIntosh Middle School announced that following the news of her body being found, they were going to open up to the community and offer grief counseling for those affected. The impact of the crime was so enormous that parents were too frightened to even let their daughters walk to the mailbox. The community held a vigil outside her house, showing Carlie and her family just how much they were loved and supported. On the 9th of February, Joseph spoke to his mother, and the conversation went as follows. At a memorial service for Carlie held on the 10th of February, many people arrived, including Sheriff Bill Borwell. For everybody, this was the devastating outcome they had hoped and prayed would not happen. On the 20th of February 2004, Joseph Peter Smith was charged with kidnapping, 1 count of sexual battery, and he was also indicted on a count of first-degree murder. As this was Florida, he could face a death sentence. Before the trial could start, Carlie's grandmother passed away, with some saying she had died of a broken heart. Her grandfather left the United States and moved to Europe, where he too would later pass away. Carlie's uncle would drive his truck into a tree and die as a result of his injuries. It was reported that some had said he had done this with the intention of taking his own life. A month before the trial was due to begin, Joseph's lawyer tried to have the car wash video thrown out and the confession he allegedly gave his brother in prison. The lawyer argued that the prosecution could not prove that the digital images and the time and date stamps on the video were authentic and correct, so therefore should not be used. He also argued that when the FBI got his brother to talk to him, he had already exercised his right to remain silent and asked for an attorney. This led to him being illegally interrogated. An FBI agent said that it was John who had wanted to talk to his brother to see if he would answer any questions, and only did so after the authorities were approved for the visit by Joseph's lawyers. It was now time for Joseph Smith to go on trial. The evidence was strong. The footage from the car wash, the evidence from the Buick, the fact he was driving the Buick at the time, the DNA found on her clothes, and him being able to tell them where her body was. It was a difficult and confronting trial without question. For those who had held out hope, searched for her, and been there for her loved ones, it was extremely tough to sit through the details of what had happened to her. One of the people to testify was John, Joseph's brother, but this was not without its problems. Prosecutor Deborah Reaver asked Judge Andrew Owens to declare John as an adverse witness, also known as a hostile witness. At this point, John was facing charges for drug possession and armed robbery. It was reported that John had admitted that during his testimony, he was actually high on crack cocaine. After all of the evidence had been presented to the jury, they soon came back with a verdict. On November 18, 2005, you could feel the tension in the courtroom. The judge warned everyone. Carlie Brucia's mother broke down crying and said, "Thank you, Jesus." Carlie's father simply nodded in approval. Joseph Smith was guilty on all counts. Deputies began preparing to take Smith away when the judge had to slow them down. The jury took 5 hours to pore over the evidence: the surveillance video, the letter that Smith sent to his brother, and the recorded conversations between Smith and his mother, where he admitted killing her. Just a few weeks later, on the 1st of December, a jury voted 10-2 that Joseph Smith should be executed by lethal injection. Joseph asked the judge to spare him for the sake of his family. However, on the 15th of March the following year, the judge officially sentenced Joseph Smith to death for his crimes. Carlie endured unimaginable trauma that began at the time of her kidnapping. The image of the defendant taking her arm and leading her away will no doubt be forever etched in our minds. At 11 years of age, there is no doubt she was aware of her dire predicament and that she had little or no hope of survival. Her death was conscious, pitiless, calculated, and premeditated. Joseph Smith, based on your actions, you have forfeited your right to live freely among us. Following his death sentence, Carlie's stepfather Stephen said afterwards, Carlie's mother was not in court for the sentencing, as she was being held in prison on prostitution and drugs charges. She said that she had turned to drugs to numb the agony of losing Carlie. After being sent to death row, Joseph Smith launched several appeals against his sentence. None of his appeals had been successful so far, but everything would soon change. The defendant is guilty of murder, and Smith was sentenced to death. However, this week, a circuit judge ordered that he be given a new sentencing trial. This stems from a recent Supreme Court ruling requiring juries to be unanimous when sentencing someone to death. Carlie's father, Joe Brucia, is furious about the new development. Joe Brucia and his family are writing letters asking the governor and the attorney general to step in and do the right thing. In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the Florida law unconstitutional, since the death penalty could be imposed without a unanimous jury verdict. In 2018, the Florida Supreme Court also dropped Smith's death sentence, which was reinstated in 2020. Now, nearly a year later, the Florida Supreme Court has ordered a new sentencing hearing for Smith. A circuit court will only consider Smith's sentence and not his conviction, and a hearing date has yet to be set. Don Batts reflected on Carlie Brucia more than most. He's the caretaker of her memorial at the Central Church of Christ and comes here to reflect about Brucia. He remembers his own granddaughter, who was murdered years ago. Joe was very critical of the justice system, saying, "I feel so let down by the system because Joseph Smith was on parole before he got to my daughter. He was supposed to go back to jail for 5 years if he violated. He did violate. He was passed out with a bag of cocaine in a parking lot. Instead of giving him the consequence they said they would, they gave him drug offender probation, which is just semantics. And that's why my daughter's not here today." Joe realized that he wasn't the only parent grieving a child who had been allegedly killed by someone on parole or probation. He discovered this was a nationwide problem and contacted Representative Katherine Harris, asking her to do something so Carlie's death would not be in vain. Harris later introduced legislation named Carlie's Law. At a press conference, she said, "We must act now to protect our children from criminal repeat offenders who would use society's second chance to commit more acts of violence. The law would take federal felons back into custody if they committed another felony offense, an offense intending to result in sexual contact with someone under the age of 16, or a crime of violence. It would also add a year-long extension to the Amber Alert grants, which help issue alerts about abducted and at-risk children. Due to the cost that the new bill would likely incur, it faced pushback from the state's top prison official, who said it would cost nearly $1 billion to put those with criminal records like Joseph Smith back in custody. Joe responded, "I find it very offensive that they say it costs too much money. No one has the right to put a price on my daughter's head or any other child's." Despite this, Carlie's law was not reintroduced. It's hard to believe that 10 years ago this week, a little Sarasota girl was abducted at a car wash, sparking a search that captured national attention. 10 years ago today, the world witnessed a kidnapping caught on tape. Carlie Brucia was found days later, murdered. She was only 11, her body left behind a church. Now, a decade later, that church still honors that little girl by trying to protect other children, said Stephen Knorr, Carlie Brucia's stepfather, addressing the large crowd gathered at the Central Church of Christ. It's hard to believe that 10 years ago this week, a little Sarasota girl was abducted at a car wash, sparking a search that captured national attention. 10 years ago today, the world witnessed a kidnapping caught on tape. Carlie Brucia was found days later, murdered. She was only 11, her body left behind a church. Now, a decade later, that church still honors that little girl by trying to protect other children, said Stephen Knorr, Carlie Brucia's stepfather, addressing the large crowd gathered at the Central Church of Christ. Carlie's mother, Susan, was too emotional to speak at the place her daughter's body was found 4 days after her abduction. Hopefully it made all kids aware, and adults aware that it can happen to you. When you hear about it being somewhere else, you never think it'll happen here in your backyard. The massive search and tragic discovery are hard to forget, even for seasoned officers who attended the memorial. For something like this to happen to her, I think it is probably our worst nightmare, but it also gave us that sense of vigilance and brought us all together to try to bring him to justice. Smith sits on death row, but in the past 10 years, the church has worked with the community, sponsoring 8 kids' safety rallies among other campaigns, all in memory of a little girl gone too soon, said Bradenton Police Department's Assistant Chief Paul McWade. He later confirmed that Joseph Smith was now also a suspect in another murder, the murder of 25-year-old Tara Riley. He added that he intended to have officers talk to Smith about it while he was on death row. In March 2000, Tara Riley's naked body was found in a retention pond behind a Walmart in Florida. Tips had come in, but there was nothing concrete. She had been seen arguing in the parking lot with someone, and 2 years after her murder, the police questioned someone matching the description, but there was not enough evidence to file charges. Before long, her case went cold, and her files gathered dust, with any hope of catching her killer fading more and more as the years passed. 6 years later, though, in a recorded phone call, her name resurfaced. As Joseph sat in prison, he had a call with his brother and mother. They were asking him a series of questions, one of them being, he added that he believed his brother was responsible for her murder. 17 years after Carlie's abduction and murder, there was a breaking news announcement. 55-year-old Joseph Smith had died at the Union Correctional Institution on the 26th of July, 2021. His cause of death was not immediately announced, but it was later reported that he had died as a result of liver cancer, while other sources said it was after contracting hepatitis C. The Florida State Attorney's Office said in a statement, Carlie's father said he felt wonderful when he heard that Joseph had died. It's long overdue. The inept and corrupt criminal justice system could not get it done, so the natural order of things finally took care of it. Joseph Smith was never charged in connection with Tara Riley's murder, and her case remains unsolved. The truth about his potential involvement with other crimes, including hers, will now likely never be known. John said he wished his brother had confessed. Now, loved ones are reaching out again, pleading for help to restore Carlie's memorial garden, which has been neglected and vandalized. Family friend Sherry Langworthy, her husband and Carlie's cousin, have worked for the last 3 weeks trying to restore the garden. I want her legacy, her memory, to live on. I want it to be an awareness thing, for parents to take their kids here and teach them what can happen. Local volunteers and businesses helped maintain the garden, And the impact of Carlie Brucia's murder was far-reaching and long-lasting for her devastated mother, Susan. Susan's life was never the same. Recently, it was reported that Susan Shoren had passed away. "Shoren is the mother of Carlie Brucia," said Haley, a reporter. "Over the years, a lot of folks have been saddened by Carlie's death. Tonight, they are all grieving for her mom." Pastor Rod Myers of the Central Church of Christ remembered Susan as a very dedicated mother who loved her daughter very much. He vividly recalled one encounter with Susan. "Susan and I, and Sheriff Buell at the time, we all came out and had a prayer near where Carlie was found, and that was a very meaningful time to me." Carlie Brucia was just 11 years old. She had so much to do and so much to see. A life of endless promise clearly lay ahead of her. She was someone who made people feel loved, always being sure to greet her friends with a big hug and a friendly smile. It is through those happy memories that her spirit continues to live on and be with those who knew and loved her. As her father Joe said, "My family and I talk about her, and we have photos of her all around the house. She's in our hearts and minds all the time."